All right. We've had an absolutely fantastic thing happen. Through the email system, we had a wonderful congratulation and an address for this conference from Prince El Hassan bin Talal of Jordan. And I'd like to start the conference by reading out his good wishes for us. And I think it's wonderful that he took the time to write to us. So he says, at the outset, I would like to congratulate the organisers of the Ministry for Peace Initiative for introducing this idea as a reflection of public feeling. We all want a peaceful environment for our families and ourselves. We all have something to contribute to a movement for peace among and between the peoples of a steadily shrinking world. To the extent that British democracy, popular opinion, and the pursuit of the public good are elements that work in parallel, a Ministry for Peace is the governmental institution whose time has come. In the USA at the moment, Congressman Dennis Kucinich has put forward a proposal for a US Department of Peace, as John referred to. The International Peace Bureau continues to bring together peace builders to promote international cooperation and non-violent solutions to international conflicts. Its publication, Peace is Possible, has compiled success stories from around the world to encourage further success. The Helsinki Citizens' Assembly has brought together Turks, Armenians, and Azeris to talk to each other. And I wonder, from my Middle Eastern context, what makes us think in our part of the world that our hatreds are any more profound or less resolvable. One of the differences between Britain and less developed countries is that you have a stronger civil society, and middle classes with the leisure and education to begin engineering change. In The Observer recently, I was interested to read a plea for more and better use of public space and public dialogue, following the Royal Society of Art's call for coffee shop conversation on public issues. There is no democracy without a demos. The public, as an entity, is formed through dialogue and exchange without the threat of losing or the desire of winning, as is too often the case in the so-called public debate transmitted by the media. I've told the story many times of how in 1994 in Aqaba, with my late brother, the late King Hussein, at the signing of the peace treaty between Jordan and Israel, I was asked by Israeli media, "What do you think of all this?" I replied, and I wish that my words had not subsequently been borne out by events, with all due respect to the personalities involved, peace is not just about talking heads. This peace will only succeed when it becomes a warm peace, a people's peace. With the late Sadruddin Aga Khan, I had the honor to chair an independent commission which reported to the United Nations on the desirability of promoting a new international humanitarian order. That was in 1983, and the proposal continues to be endorsed every year without being put into effect. We can promote the new economic order, the new technological order, the new communications order, but as soon as the words humanitarian and human rights appear, it seems that political reservations emerge. A new international humanitarian order means simply that we maintain a proper emphasis on peace for human beings, rather than a realpolitik of peace. In a democracy or a would-be democracy, isn't peace about the conscious, even the stubborn maintenance of peacefulness between people? This is why the role of interfaith dialogue in peacemaking within and between countries is not really about religions talking to one another. It's about the adherents of religions talking to one another. Over the past few decades, we've seen many meetings in which high-level representatives of the faiths have come together to proclaim a common ground between their beliefs and scriptures. Now we need to make this a people's peace. We need to find ways to bring together millions of individuals to talk to each other, not at each other, about their values, their convictions, their hopes, and their anxieties. It's said that if you want people to agree with you, just invite your friends round for dinner. But if you want to make a change in the world, you must find a way to talk to those who disagree, your enemies, and those who disapprove of you in some way. Technology has turned up the volume of our agreements and disagreements, but it has not taught us how to disagree. A civilized framework for disagreement might be one way to define the difficult word peace. Peace, to those who've seriously worked at it at a high level, is not merely the absence of war. It is a process which has to be continuously restarted with every new birth. It's easy for a human to agree peaceably with another. It's much less easy to disagree, And I think that the most important skill we can learn today is how to disagree or how to agree upon rules of disagreement. This means, as I have often emphasized, a code of conduct for state actors and non-state actors and a concerted effort towards broad compliance with that code. It means clear and unambiguous definitions of such terms as terror and terrorism. It means at the level of the individual citizen undertaking the responsibility to converse at a level which is not necessarily comfortable or reassuring with people very different from oneself, and to acknowledge agreements across cultural, religious, and political divides without having to resolve all disagreements first. As the Imam Shatibi said, each of us is to enhance what is universal and respect difference. In English, I think the word respect often gets glossed over with the concept tolerate. I do not want to tolerate you and have you tolerate me. I want to respect you and to feel that even if you do not respect me, you can respect what I stand for. Respecting difference in the end means acknowledging the right of another to believe sincerely that one is wrong. That is not easy. A Ministry for Peace as a government department might be expected to be more concerned about a foreign policy advisory role than about citizens conferencing. But I personally hope that this will not prove to be the case. I believe that for change to occur, any top-down approach must meet with a bottom-up approach, whether in a democracy or a dictatorship. The final authority of any political power is vested in the people's acceptance of that power, and the glory of a democratic system is that it recognizes this fact and builds upon it. If a Ministry for Peace is also a ministry for peacefulness, then I think we have reason to hope for a future in which our children can disagree without violence and agree to work together on shared problems.
As I said, today what we want to do is explore the different avenues we will need to pursue in convincing people of the need for a Ministry for Peace. And we're starting off with one of the key issues, which is this one about the cost of war and how we can provide an alternative which is actually cost-effective as well. So really taking on the main argument that is often thrown against us on economic terms, the hard economic issues. And our two speakers, our first speaker is John Randall MP. John was one of those MPs who spoke up against the war in Kosovo and is a Conservative MP and was a whip who resigned over his position over the issue of the war in Iraq. Courageously spoke out on principle about the issues around the need for peace rather than war. I'm glad that the Conservative Party have had the good sense to reappoint him since. John Randall, my colleague and friend.
Well, thank you very much. I never really know the best way to start a speech, but I remember being told as a very new Member of Parliament of the Home Secretary, who was asked to address an audience of prisoners in one of Her Majesty's establishments. He didn't really know how to start and how to address them. And so he finally settled on, "It's a great pleasure to see so many of you here today." Well, it's a great pleasure for me to see you all here today, and for probably rather different reasons. Now, this isn't the normal habitat for a Conservative MP, and a whip, as John said, to boot. But I'll let you into a little secret that I think the definite highlight of my political career was standing next to Tony Benn, Tam Dalyell and Alice Mahon in Trafalgar Square speaking out against the NATO bombing in Yugoslavia. In fact, I think it was that whole sorry episode 5 years ago became a seminal moment for me, and I began to realise that there had to be a better way. Something else I've learnt in Westminster is that short speeches are much more appreciated than long ones, so I'm going to try and keep my comments to a minimum, and I know there are far more eloquent and knowledgeable people following me on during the day. But I believe that it's self-evident that efforts for peace, if they're going to stand a chance, have got to cross political divides. After all, that's what it's all about. And finding common ground and respecting each other's position is very important. I'd rather like to think that in Hillingdon, we're already doing our bit by example. So John MacDonald there is my near neighbour in Hillingdon, and I think that the fact that we can share a common platform on something as fundamental as this shows that we can have the will to do that. Now, this section is supposed to be entitled Peace is Cheaper, and of course it is. It doesn't really need me to spell it out. There are other speakers following me who I'm sure will do it in a much more profound way. But in the long term, it's going to be far cheaper because our world depends on peace. Our environment cannot afford the attacks that are increasingly bombarded on it by conflicts. It could be the burning of oil wells. It could be depleted uranium. But the environmental cost is incalculable. But even the short-term savings are obvious. The peace dividend, sadly, of the post-Cold War period has not been spent on what we all hoped it would be, but it's on new confrontations which are every bit as scary as the old threats. Now, I'm probably going to disappoint many of you to say that I'm not by nature a pacifist, although I have a sneaking feeling I'm increasingly going down that line. I think there will be occasions when a ministry for peace might not succeed, but surely it's always worth giving every opportunity to attempt other means of solving our problems other than by violence. Now, I noticed on the Ministry for Peace website, it's an excellent website, a forum where someone, it may well be somebody who's in this room at the moment, suggested that the parameters should be widened to include mediation leading to reduction of other forms of violence, things that we sadly see all too often today, violence against the person and bullying. Well, I don't think there's any argument amongst the electorate widely that those are things that we've all got to work towards. And such a plan is not an airy-fairy, pie-in-the-sky idea. So I cannot see for the life of me that if we try and do that in our own lives, why we can't translate it into action on a wider stage. And I think that today's pipe dreams can easily become reality if there's a will. Last year, as we know, we saw a huge movement of people across the world peacefully protesting against war. In Britain, we saw young and old, left and right, white, black, everything in between. And they took to the streets to say, "Not in our name." Just before that, a month or so, I'd been in Serbia, and I'd seen at first hand what devastation had been caused there and what smart bombs actually do. But I also went, in the half-term holiday, to see the battlefield of Waterloo and the trenches of the First World War. And I suddenly realized it was all happening all over again. Perhaps we think that this idea of promoting peace is a new one. But I think every generation's thought of this. I can remember reading Voltaire's Candide as a school, later at college, War and Peace, and a whole load of literature over the years. And actually, even politicians were thinking about this and speaking out. I've actually trawled through some Hansards, and I found Charles James Fox speaking these words in the House of Commons on the 3rd of February, 1800. "Oh, pity the condition of man, gracious God, and save us from such a system of malevolence, in which all our old venerated prejudices are to be done away, and by which we are taught to consider war as the natural state of man, and peace a dangerous and difficulty extremity. Sir, this temper must be corrected. It is a diabolical spirit, and would lead to interminable war. At what time did we ever profit by obstinately persevering in war?" Those words were spoken 204 years ago. So come on, let's this be the century for peace. Bring on the ministry for peace.
Peace Direct, who's been one of the most articulate advocates of the cause of peace and the issues around the economic effects of war. Excellent.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I suppose most of us in this room would find plenty to criticise in the record of this present government on the subject that we're talking about. But I want to suggest two things that we could actually support. Does anybody here know what the initials GCPP stand for? One person in the back. Can you tell me something? That's right. GCPP stands for Global Conflict Prevention Pools. And this is actually an idea that Gordon Brown and Claire Short initiated in the year 2000 to bring together the Ministry of Defence, the Foreign Office, and the Department for International Development in a cooperative effort to invest in conflict prevention. And as far as I know, it's a unique initiative, and I think it's one very much to be supported. There are a number of problems with it. One is that I think the Ministry of Defence has had the stronger say amongst the three ministries, in that many of the projects being undertaken, if you read the report published in October this year by the Foreign Office, many of the projects being undertaken do involve military security, in inverted commas. Not all of them by any means. There are some excellent projects undertaken, particularly in Sierra Leone and different parts of West Africa that do not. But one of the things which has been very much debated is the supply, for example, of vertical takeoff aircraft for Nepal under this program. The other problem is that the total budget at the moment of the conflict prevention pools put together, there's one for Africa and there's one for the rest of the world, is in the region of £120 million per annum. And by contrast, I'm sure we're all aware what we as a nation spend on defence and the military, which is in the region of £32 billion. The other problematic about this initiative is that the word conflict prevention becomes a kind of a buzzword and is in danger of being co-opted, I think, in that if you read the Ministry of Defence white paper that came out just before Christmas, they used the word conflict prevention a great deal. But they also don't seem to realise the irony, which is a mild word to describe it, of the fact that I'm a researcher, so I always look at the supporting essays. And supporting essay number 4 of the Ministry of Defence white paper, which you can find on the web, has a diagram of the Ministry of Defence plans for greater security. And in that diagram, it has conflict prevention in a box right alongside support for British arms exports. Now this lack of coherence at the heart of government decision-making really does need addressing. And I think there's very little of more practical value that this movement could do than address the fact that our government, as we very well know, and as Caroline Lucas just pointed out, competes each year to be number 2 or number 3 in world arms sales, while at the same time saying, and I quote the very phrase in this report that we've just brought out, which you can get outside, they compete on the one hand to be number 2 or number 3, and at the same time say that conflict prevention rests on the removal, confiscation and destruction of small arms in areas of conflict. So that lack of coherence very urgently needs to be addressed. The second fact on which I think we can support this government is that they've gone as far as introducing a public service agreement on the issue of conflict prevention. Now, did anybody in this hall know that? No. It's almost unknown, but I just want to quickly read you the text of it because it's actually very exciting stuff. The wording is, improved effectiveness of the UK contribution to conflict prevention and management as demonstrated by a reduction in the number of people whose lives are affected by violent conflict and a reduction in the potential sources of future conflict where the UK can make a significant contribution. Now that's a public service agreement and it is therefore measurable, and if you look in the appendix of my report, you'll find out exactly how that PSA is to be measured. Right down to the fact that, for example, a 10% reduction in fatalities from the Stockholm International Institute's baseline for reduction in deaths in Afghanistan, Nepal, Macedonia, Georgia, Israel and the occupied territories, and Sri Lanka. So those, the figures that the PSA is to get us towards are actually written down. So you've got real grist to work with here with your MPs. They can't simply palm you off with a meaningless letter. You want this, we want this PSA to be enacted. Now I just want to come on to the question of peace for the pound. From the available figures, it's likely, I think it's probably certain, that non-military interventions, while slower, not only tend to cause less destruction than bombing or armed intervention, but they actually work better in saving lives. They are distinctly cheaper, as you've just said. In 1999, the Oxford Research Group examined 240 cases of non-violent interventions in conflict in different parts of the world, and we published the 50 most effective ones in this book that most of you, I think, know, War Prevention Works. These case studies show that small groups of highly motivated people, determined not to use weapons, can achieve extraordinary results in preventing or stopping killing. And what they do costs peanuts compared to military intervention. We summarized these interventions on a poster which comes with the book. And down the left-hand column, we've indicated where we could find it out, how much each of these 50 interventions actually cost. Let me give you 3 quick examples. The bitter civil war in Mozambique was effectively and conclusively stopped by an intervention by an Italian NGO, the community of Sant'Egidio, between 1989 and 1992, where they went and actually negotiated between Renamo and Frelimo in Mozambique, and bringing about that bottom-up and top-down peace cost $350,000. That's all. Then in El Salvador, a businessman decided that he'd had enough of his trucks being hijacked at gunpoint when the country was awash with weapons after a civil war. So he went to the Archbishop and said, "Can I borrow the cathedral in San Salvador for a weekend?" And he offered a $100 food voucher for every working gun turned in. In one weekend, he got guns turned in worth $103,000, and he had $19,000 in the bank. So he went to the president of El Salvador and said, "Would you join me in this scheme?" The president said yes, and the long and short of it was that in the course of the next months and years, it went on for 3 years, this scheme, they collected 10,000 weapons. And the third example I want to give you is the task force set up in former Yugoslavia in 1999 to forge effective united democratic opposition to Milosevic, and that cost $240,000. And this brings me to the power, the sheer power of non-violence when it's systematically organized. It does not just happen. As the South Africans said in the film we've just seen, what had to take place to bring about an absolutely stunning success of non-violence in South Africa. I lived there for 10 years, and I thought we were heading for a civil war which would take about 5 or 6 million lives. And actually, because of what happened not only to Mandela when he was in jail, because don't forget, he went into jail as a terrorist. He came out coordinating with vast numbers of other people in a systematic training of people in methods of solving their different and massive differences. You can't have bigger differences than existed there without using weapons, in collaboration and with the support of people from outside. Some of the biggest removals of the most oppressive regimes have happened non-violently, and we kind of say, oh, we kind of take them for granted. Look at what happened in the so-called Velvet Revolution in Eastern Europe. The communist regimes in Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria were removed, and it wasn't just because the Soviet government weakened. It was because through 20 years of organizing, through the Helsinki Citizens' Assembly, people all over Eastern Europe were strengthened and knew what they were doing. It's very well written up in several books to be able to gradually take power. So a civil society grew up and was powerful enough by the time it was needed that it knew how to take the steps to get rid of its own oppressors. And that, to my mind, is what should have happened and could have happened in Iraq. It would have been slower, it would have been more difficult than bombing, but it would have caused far less devastation, and it would not have resulted in the levels of bitterness, revenge, humiliation, and trouble in store for decades to come. I would like to close by suggesting that the methods used by the Ministry for Peace movement, if I may call it that, should be exactly coherent with its aims. In other words, that we should not approach those whose decisions we would like to influence from a position of I'm right and you're wrong, from the moral high ground. I know the moral high ground like the back of my hand. I'm very used to standing on it, and it's the wrong place to be. It doesn't work in terms of dialogue. As I think Prince Hassan said in his beautiful message, we have to be willing to admit that we might be wrong in order to be able to hear the point of view of other people. But having said that, I would like to suggest or request that these ideas and this movement are taken not only to the converted, not only to sister movements, but right into the decision-making environments where they're most needed. How many people here have attended the annual general meeting of an arms production company? Not one hand, almost went up. Buy some shares in British Aerospace and go along to the annual general meeting and witness it. And, if you can, stand up and put a different point of view, non-violently. It's a big challenge. It takes a lot of guts. and it's very worth doing. This movement should be being discussed in the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I'm sure you both go and attend their meetings. I do. This sort of language is not current there. It should be discussed at Chatham House, at the Royal Institute for International Affairs, and so on. There could be, I should say rather than should, there could be seminars eventually within the Ministry of Defence on this issue. Because those are the people that we need to engage with, to draw in, not into a debate, not into an argument, but into a dialogue, so that the methods are coherent with the aims of this fine movement. Thank you.
And our first speaker is Paul Ingram, the far end here, who will be coming over here in a second, who's a senior analyst for the British American Security Council, and he's going to be talking about a topic that was started this morning, government subsidies on arms. Paul.
Okay, before I start by outlining to you the subsidies that we as British taxpayers give away to arms companies to supply the world with British equipment, I want to go into why this is actually such an important issue. Because it's important not only for the obvious reasons that the British government is actually supplying weapons at our expense, but also it is possibly one of the most obvious chinks in Tony Blair's armour when he talks about Britain being a force for good in the world. How can Britain be a force for good when we are actually going out of our way as a government promoting arms exports around the world in areas where we have sources of instability, human rights problems and other issues? It does bring into question this whole claim that Britain acts as a force for good. Then there's the issue which goes even broader than that, which is around the relationship between industry and politics. This is one of the most obvious key nexus of power between political power and economic power. And as more and more political power is handed over voluntarily by politicians within British society, we as those who take part in the democratic system, lose more and more of our influence upon the important things in our lives. As corporations take more control over the decisions that affect us, we lose that power. And it is in many respects this nexus of power between arms companies and the exporters and the way in which we can control that comes together with arms export subsidies. There's a few colleagues of mine, a few friends who are involved in the anti-globalization movement, who are complaining about the way in which more and more we move towards free markets. Well, I have to tell you this, we are a long way away from a free market in this situation, because we, as taxpayers, are actually supporting a very distorted market, a market that it has turned into a buyer's market, where if people can get by the controls, the export controls that are placed by governments who are exporting arms, and believe me, it's not that difficult to do so, then you come across arms that are actually way below the cost of producing them in many instances, and that's because of the arms subsidies that I'm going to be outlining, because Britain is far from alone in giving these arms export subsidies. In fact, we exist in a world where, in terms of the arms trade globally, it's far from being a free market. It's actually being a market that's buoyed up by subsidies, and that the competition there is more competition between governments falling over themselves to subsidise their own chosen national companies than it is between companies competing against each other. So how can I say such really broad and sweeping facts, broad and sweeping analysis, and claiming that the subsidies are so large? Well, I've looked into the subsidies over the last few years, and it's come clear to me that in terms of British subsidies, we're talking well over £500 million annually, going from British taxpayers to companies that usually, though not exclusively, reside within this country. The most obvious subsidies come from a direct support that the British government gives from, for example, the recent Dicey Arms Fair that was held in East London, supported by the Defence Export Services Organisation based within the Ministry of Defence. That has a budget of somewhere in the region of £13 to £14 million net. That's the cost to the British taxpayer after taking into account its income. But then, much broader than that, you have a network of military attachés around the world, one of whose main purposes is to sell British equipment to the governments within the countries that they're based. And there are other embassy staff too. I was talking to the British ambassador to Iran in the 1970s. He said to me that over 90% of his time was taken up in one form or another over contracts for British arms companies with the Shah. That's pretty unusual, but nevertheless indicative of what embassy staff are doing. The Foreign Office, indeed, is talking more and more about its key purpose being to promote British exports, not just arms exports, but British exports, rather than the usual sort of diplomacy that one would expect. Then you have the use of military units, paid for by the British taxpayer. You have official visits, both royal and senior officials and politicians. In 2002, we had no fewer than 3 official visits from the Foreign Secretary, the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister to India, primarily to sell Hawk trainer aircraft. You have the Defence Assistance Fund, and you have other tools that the government uses. I calculate these to come to roughly £58 million net cost to the British taxpayer. But that's peanuts when you come to actually looking at the Export Credit Guarantees Department, a department whose sole purpose is to promote exports, who last year gave 50% of its guarantees to the military sector. The Export Credit Guarantees Department essentially ensures exporters so that if the contracts that they write go bad, then the British taxpayer picks up the bill. They take an insurance premium for doing so, but the net cost is quite significant. And in fact, after comparing the premium rates that are charged by Export Credit Guarantees Department with those that would be offered on the private finance markets, which are, after all, quite heavily developed in this area, I come to a figure of a roughly £150 million subsidy. I'll be giving evidence to the Trade and Industry Committee in a couple of weeks' time on exactly that issue of export credits. Then we come to a figure that is extremely difficult to come to, the distortion of the Ministry of Defence procurement. Now, essentially what this is that if the Ministry of Defence bought its equipment on grounds of value for money, rather than the more complex concepts that it does use, which include quite near the top of its list the promotion of British exports abroad, then we can compare the amount of money that is actually subsidising those exports. I want to tell you a very quick story around an export of Hawk trainer aircraft that I've already talked about with these visits. It won't take me very long. The Ministry of Defence was considering, in the middle of last year, competition for the purchase of trainer aircraft between British Aerospace Hawk aircraft and an Italian jet, which many within the Ministry of Defence believed was a more superior jet which it could purchase for, probably in the lifetime of the project, for £1 billion less. And this was considered by officials, and the recommendation going to the Defence Secretary at the end of the process was to buy the Italian jet. Value for money, and it presented a better piece of kit for the British Armed Forces. The Treasury looked into this, and they too came to the same conclusion. There was a battle within the Cabinet, and Jeff Hoon and Tony Blair overruled Gordon Brown and the Ministry of Defence's own staff, and went with the Hawk trainer jet. And the reason for doing so was primarily because George Fernandez, the Defence Secretary in India, was saying that he was not going to purchase the Hawk jet unless the British MOD did so themselves, because he was afraid that he wouldn't get the support in the 10-year lifetime of the programme. Now, what that meant was that British taxpayers were paying £1 billion extra for kit that was not as good, because we needed to support BAE Systems and their exports to India. That distortion of MOD procurement, I estimate, just on that one contract alone, is probably roughly £200 million a year for the next 5 years. Then we look at the tax breaks for corruption. Now, corruption is illegal in this country, has been for a long while, even though I was outlining at the beginning how actually our system is actually very corrupt. Explicit corruption is illegal. It has only very recently become illegal to bribe foreign officials to purchase, to encourage them to purchase British kit. But not only has it not been illegal to do that until recently, but companies had tax breaks to do so. So I estimate the subsidy from that to be about £50 million. Now, it's still illegal to do that, but the government hasn't enforced that, and it hasn't given that task to any enforcement agency yet. So it still carries on for all we know. So it's very difficult to know or put a figure to that, but I'm still using £50 million. They need to be doing something about corruption. And then there's the research and development. We spend, our government spends £2 billion a year on military research and development. Much of that goes into developing weapons that are then exported abroad. Very difficult to come to any sort of judgment. And I've left that off our figures. So even without that £500 million, which would be the share of that research and development going into exports, we still come up with a final figure of somewhere in the region of £500 million a year going into subsidising the arms trade. Now, why is this done? I'm often told it's in order that we have cost-effective procurement, but I've already dealt with the ways in which actually we don't have cost-effective procurement in this country for the very reason that we are promoting arms exports. I'm often told that we need to support British industry, but actually much of this industry is not British. Even British Aerospace itself has dropped its name and called itself BAE Systems because half its operations are in the States. We are talking about a globalised industry, an industry that moves its employment, its suppliers all over the world, buying the cheapest that it can. Most of the suppliers to the prime contractors are not in this country at all in any case. So most of the jobs created are in other countries. In any case, this doesn't bring jobs or investment to this country. MOD's own economists estimate that if we actually brought this practice to an end, we would reduce the number employed within the defence industry by around 98,000 jobs. But there'd be over 200,000 jobs created elsewhere in the economy. Because, and the reason for this, is that this industry is very capital intensive. It takes a lot of money to pay for those jobs in that industry. If that money was diverted elsewhere in the economy, then we would create more jobs. Schools, hospitals, elsewhere, jobs in those sorts of sectors. So where have we got to in the debate here in this country? We published a report, Oxford Research Group and Safer World, a report called The Subsidy Trap 2 years ago. Not long after, there was a report published by MOD's own economists in conjunction with independent economists, which basically came to the conclusions there were no subsidies, nor any significant benefit to this country from the practice of subsidies that I've been talking about. Indeed, the Export Credit Guarantees Department themselves have started to admit that they are giving significant subsidy to the defence industry. And yet, what is the government doing? The government has just recently, in the last year or two, published its defence industry policy, which explicitly talks about supporting British industry in this sector using taxpayers' money. We have BAE still landing contracts which are far from being competitive, such as the aircraft carrier and the Hawk deal. What can we do about this? We need to expose what I'm talking about. We need to actually wake up to what the situation is. We need to focus on the dark side as well as the light. We need to talk about very positive things like building a Ministry of Peace, but we have to be we have to avoid being naive about it, because there are lots of interests involved. There are interests involved in this system that will mitigate against change. We need to expose the hypocrisy, and we need to demand a fundamental change in culture that moves away from supporting corporations and what Eisenhower would have called the military-industrial complex. We need to move away from that system and see that it benefits not only those in faraway countries to stop supporting arms exports, but it will benefit those within our own society who are marginalised by the reduced public expenditure on schools and hospitals and the rest as a result of this system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, and it's very reassuring to hear that one of the questions that statements people make to us is, well, there'll be an enormous number of jobs that will be lost. We now have the answer to rebut that statement, so that's excellent. I'd now like to introduce Tony Juniper, who's the Executive Director of Friends of the Earth, and he's going to talk about the environmental costs of war.
Many thanks, and first of all, a big thank you for the organisers in giving me the opportunity to make some remarks today about what I think is very often a neglected part of conflict and what happens to the global ecosystem when we embark on projects like the Iraq War. I'd also like to say how pleased I am to be here to support such an important initiative and wish it the very best in the future in bringing the fundamental causes of conflict to public attention. Friends of the Earth obviously is an environmental movement. We're a global movement. We're operating in 70 countries worldwide, and not only are we environmental campaigners, we are also peace campaigners, and I hope that the remarks I'll make this morning will hopefully make it clear why that's the case. But not only do we campaign in the Northern Hemisphere in countries like England and the USA in bringing the environmental consequences of conflict to public attention, we're also very active in the Southern Hemisphere. And I'm just thinking as I'm sitting here on the lectern about my colleagues in Colombia and El Salvador who have conflict and militarism built right into the heart of their environmental campaigns, and for many obvious reasons. So the connections between conflict and the environment are very many, and they're very profound, but they're very rarely discussed in the political discussions that go on around conflict, certainly not in this country. And thinking back a year ago and the political debate that furiously raged around the alleged links between the Iraqi regime and terrorism, about weapons of mass destruction, about Saddam Hussein's human rights record, about the role of the United Nations in supporting conflict or not, the wider ramifications for peace in the region and worldwide, and the impacts on civilians of conflict. All of these things were being debated, but the environment was hardly there. It was very much in the margins, if at all, even though the environment ultimately is always the wider theatre in which war is conducted. Having said that, though, I think many people, certainly the people in this room I would think, would be pretty familiar with some of the environmental impacts of war, and some of those impacts are becoming depressingly familiar. I guess if you polled people in the UK at least, the most dramatic images I think people would have in seeing the environmental costs of conflict would be in relation to the first Gulf War and Saddam Hussein's torching of the Kuwaiti oil and gas fields and the discharge of crude oil into the Persian Gulf. A sea coated with crude oil, with birds dying in the slicks, became iconic of how the impact of war can be so damaging on the environment. And so did the great towering columns of smoke that blotted out the sun to the point where normal temperatures in that region were dramatically lowered and health-threatening pollution affected many thousands of people over a huge area. And Saddam Hussein, in his long-running campaign against the marsh Arabs of the Tigris and Euphrates Delta, also caused ecological mayhem in the wholesale drainage of those marshes where those people still live. An internationally important wetland for biodiversity, as well as an utterly unique historical and cultural landscape and ecosystem, was partly destroyed in his campaign against his own people, who he saw as enemies inside his own country. Both of these examples, I think, are really a demonstration of the environment being used as a weapon of war, not only as the bystander consequences, really, of a conflict. It was used deliberately to inflict harm. But of course, it's not only brutal dictators who cause environmental mayhem as a consequence of conflicts they choose to engage with. The bombing of factories and other targets by NATO forces during the Kosovo War caused terrible pollution there too, for example. And during the NATO attacks on Serb targets during that campaign, according to one estimate, 81 civilian industrial facilities, including oil refineries, petrochemical plants, and chemical fertilizer factories, were attacked or destroyed. Power stations hit by bombs released toxic oils into the ground, and pharmaceutical and other chemical factories deliberately released poisonous chemicals into the ground and into the rivers as a precautionary means to avoid explosions caused by air attack. Tens of thousands of people were exposed to deadly pollution, while gross contamination of the vast Danube River took place too, leading to damage to internationally important wetlands again, as well as to contamination of the Black Sea. Whether this pollution and the costs of it was factored into the NATO equation of risks and benefits of it being involved in that campaign was never made clear, although on this subject, Tony Blair never replied to a letter we sent to him from Friends of the Earth. We also never got a reply from the Prime Minister when we asked questions about the use of depleted uranium munitions that were in wide use during the Kosovo campaign, as well as, of course, in both of the Gulf Wars. This material is routinely used in projectiles used by British and American forces in order to penetrate armoured vehicles, reinforce concrete bunkers, and other tough targets. Trouble is, it's both toxic and radioactive, and DU is believed to pose a serious health risk if breathed as dust in the environment, which presumably it is and has been by many, many thousands of people, both in Iraq and Kosovo. And if the mass epidemic of cancers and other terrible diseases after the first Gulf War is anything to go by, presumably there's something there that still needs to be looked at. And while modern war, with its high technology weaponry and so-called smart bombs, is often claimed by our political leaders to be more discerning of civilian impacts, the deliberate destruction of infrastructure, such as power, water, sewerage, road and rail communications, certainly leads to great hardship and death from, for example, disease, failure of medical and emergency services, water pollution, and food shortages and hunger. How many people died or suffered from these impacts during the recent invasion of Iraq has not, as far as I know, been systematically calculated and certainly not widely reported. Certainly not dominated the headlines in the way that the loss of American and British soldiers has been, tragic though that is too. And while the politicians and media tend to focus on the immediate casualties arriving from particular bombing campaigns, they tend to ignore the wider and less dramatic and longer-term consequences of conflicts. Landmines blight the lives of millions of people worldwide and make the environment unusable in many places. So do bomblets dropped from cluster munitions. Longer term still, the pollution contained in marine wrecks sunk during the Second World War is only now beginning to contribute to a pulse of deadly pollution as ships on the seabed in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans leach materials into ocean ecosystems. That will cause biological damage. And then there is the use of deliberate use of chemicals to advance military ends. And whilst we hear great pronouncements of contempt by the Americans against people who use weapons, chemical weapons of mass destruction, it was the Americans who used widespread 2,4-D, the euphemistically named Agent Orange, during the Vietnam campaigns, as a means to defoliate large areas of forest to expose the North Vietnamese army to American helicopters. Brought to us by those environmental champions at the Monsanto Corporation, this is a very serious and powerful plant toxin. It's also poisonous to animals, including humans, and continues to cause problems today. And as far as those incredible forests were concerned, new species are being found there all the time. Vietnam is one of the biodiversity hotspots of the world. Even a new species of cattle was found there as late as the early 1980s. Presumably, many animals and plants went extinct as a result of this conflict and the widespread use of these poisons. But the issue of environmental damage was barely mentioned, certainly not at the time. And as for the people who came into contact with these chemicals, mainly innocent civilians, grotesque consequences ensued, and those consequences endure to this day as birth abnormalities linked to the use of 2,4-D continue as a result of war chemicals used more than 3 decades ago. Similarly, in Colombia, where the war on drugs involves the use of powerful herbicides sprayed from the air over the Andean ecosystems where coca plants are cultivated in order to produce cocaine. The Andes mountain range is another place where nature has excelled itself in generating diversity and uniqueness of true planetary importance, again, imperiled by the use of chemicals in conflict. And whilst the use of those chemicals might be justified to protect public health from illegal drugs in the West, the health of the people who contract the effects of these chemicals is at best an afterthought. All of these and the other environmental impacts of war are real and serious and have vast economic and humanitarian implications. But at the same time, it's very important to look not only at the impacts of war on the environment, but longer term and the potential for continuing environmental decline to generate conflict in the future. And I think this is one area where we really do have to apply our minds in the coming decades. And Friends of the Earth is not the only place where people wonder if conflict will emerge because of environmental degradation and change. The UN's weapon inspector, Hans Blix, said that he was more worried about the state of the environment than he was about weapons of mass destruction. And one reason for that was the potential for problems like climate change to generate conflict. And while the man who many see as the arch warmonger of our times, Tony Blair, has in a similar vein said that longer term, climate change is more of a major threat to the world than terrorism. His chief scientist, David King, has said more or less the same in the House of Commons recently. One reason why these figures have suggested that global warming poses such a risk is because of the potential for the profound change that will follow a warming of the atmosphere, which over the next century is anticipated to be between 2 and 5 degrees over the global average of the 20th century. Even if the mid-range proves correct, and this is coming from scientists working for the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, even in the middle of that range, about a 3-degree global warming over this century will see an estimated 3 billion people suffering from shortages of fresh water. It will also mean dramatic changes to regional climate, including in the semi-arid parts of the world, and is anticipated to lead to serious disruptions to agriculture. With serious shortages of food and water anticipated in some parts of the world, there will be very major social and economic implications arising from the pollution being generated now. And this, of course, will be most acute in the southern developing countries, the countries that are least responsible for the pollution that is now causing the climate. And even in the USA, where there is official skepticism at the highest level about climate change and the need to do anything about it, the Pentagon itself now speaks of looming global insecurity, which could lead to military conflict because of the haves and have-nots falling out in a world where the climate is dramatically altering and leading to terrible implications for people and ecosystems everywhere. And undoubtedly, one of the motivations for the invasion of Iraq, certainly for the Bush administration, was in relation to energy security. With a growing gap between rising US demand and domestic supply, finding supplies of the fossil fuels that power that economy was high on the agenda in considering invasion plans. If there is to be any basis for long-term security in the world, there must be a re-evaluation of Western energy and environmental priorities. We can't fight our way past the environmental limits that will become ever more obvious in the decades ahead. The peaceful route to the future is based upon clean, renewable energy and on restraint of the consumerist cultures of the Western nations. 9 billion people will not be able to live as 1 billion people live now. We do need to change our consumption patterns. This, of course, is a very big deal, but in the name of peace, as well as sustainability and justice, it is something that really is worth fighting for. Not least because without justice and sustainability, there can be no lasting peace. Thank you very much indeed.
Simon Woolley from Operation Black Vote, who's going to talk about coalition building for a new democracy.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak. I'd like to thank first and foremost Deborah King, who invited me to come and speak today. We've worked together on another occasion, and she said to me that she'd like my contribution here today, so I thank her for that. I want to say at the outset that I don't want to speak for long. And I have to say that it has nothing to do with the semi-final of the FA Cup being played between Arsenal and Manchester United right now. Actually, I'm a Leicester fan. I'm a Leicester City football fan for my sins. But you know, being a black man and watching a team like Arsenal, where you have players from the four corners of the globe playing with such majesty, as a black man, gives you great pride. You know, we have very little to cheer about within the black community. So when you can see that we're able to fulfill our great potential, we celebrate that. It gives me, for example, great pride to know that here today you'll have a great musician and a good friend of mine, Ian Hall, performing for you today. As a black man, that gives me great pride. It gives me no pride to see people like Condoleezza Rice or the other warmongers perpetrating the crimes and terrorism against poorer countries. You know, I heard Al Sharpton say, all my skin folk are not my kinfolk. That's the truth. Thank you. But we have a lot to do. I'm an activist. I'm a black activist fighting for social justice for black and minority ethnic communities. I collaborate with other organizations and other peoples in struggles in this country and around the world. But as I said, I don't want to speak for long. And one of the reasons is because I think at an organization, a kind of a seminar conference like this, I think it's important for you to speak. Much more than we speak from the chair. You know, people talk and talk and talk, and I know you're chomping at the bit to come back, so I'm going to try and keep it short, and I'm sure our chair will give me a nudge. But there's another reason why I want to keep it short as well, because we have a distinguished guest in our audience who very rarely gets a chance to say a few words about collaboration, coalition, support, fighting against injustice. His name is the Minister Mohammed Chester, from the Nation of Islam, and I think I would like to give over a couple of minutes of my time to him for him to say a few words, if that's okay with Deborah and the chair. We're in frightening times. I've never known it like this. In fact, anything that is comparable, I would have to go back to the 1970s when I was a young child. I remember once being walking along the street in Leicester and seeing some skinheads beat up an elderly Sikh man. I was 10 years of age, and I was terrified, mortified, with a great sense of helplessness as these skinheads beat this man. The poor elderly gentleman slumped to the ground with blood pouring from his head. And I sat there, I stood there, helpless, thinking, what can I do? And it wasn't just the what they called as Paki bashing. Remember that? Anyone that's my age and over, the Paki bashing that ensued in the 70s? The skinheads walking around with their jack boots. I remember once they were singing, send the wogs to Vietnam. Remember that? Send the wogs to Vietnam, they sang, hallelujah. And I would go home to my mother and I'd say, Mother, why do they want to send me? Why do they want to send us to Vietnam? And she held me in her arms and cried. She said to me, no one's sending you to Vietnam. I'll send them to Vietnam. You're my son and I'll look after you. But that was the climate at that time. You know, I soon wiped the tears from her when I said to her, something else I need to know, Mother. They keep asking for someone, I haven't got a clue who it is. She said, what do they keep asking? I said, they keep asking that we want a riot. I said, who is a riot? Is he a pop star or something? They were the times then. They were the times of fear that as young black child, particularly if you were Asian, you had to fear for your well-being. And sadly, them times are back. The times of hatred, the times of fear for your well-being are back in 2004. And in my opinion, much of that fear is being perpetrated by weak politicians and pernicious news editors. That's the truth. Just last week I was at the Muslim News Awards for Excellence, and Gareth Pearce, Ms. Gareth Pearce was there, she's defended a lot of the Muslims in Guantanamo Bay. She said that her organization has been collecting the vociferous, pernicious press over the last year or so, and she said, in one room, it's this high. Can you believe it? The pernicious press that is fueling the race hatred in this country. We've been collecting some ourselves and been shocked by the bile that is perpetrated, that is poisoning the minds of good people. There was one in the Spectator about a year ago, and I want to read it to you because I was just shocked that we could have a climate so pernicious, so race hate filled, that the writer would feel that they had the justification to write this. It doesn't take an extremely high IQ to figure out that the two girls who were shot in Birmingham were killed because a member of their family belonged to a rival gang. Nor does it take a genius to conclude that turf wars between mostly black gangs are fought over the control of drugs, mainly crack cocaine. Finally, only a moron would surmise that what political correct newspapers refer to as disaffected young people are black youths, sons of black youths and grandsons of black thugs, in it for the money. He went on to write in a so-called respectable newspaper, magazine, West Indians are allowed to immigrate after the war, multiply like flies, and then the great state apparatus took over the care of their multiplications. The Rivers of Blood speech by Enoch Powell was prophetic as it was true. And look what the bullshitters of the time did to that great man. Britain is being mugged by black hoodlums. That was in the Spectator last year, edited by the Tory MP, Boris Johnson. The writer, I forget his name, is still writing for them, and Boris Johnson is still the editor. That is the type of bile that is poisoning our communities. We've seen it not only in these magazines, we've seen it in The Sun. The Sun ran a piece about a year ago based on the Mr. Men. I'll read that to you too. What did it say about the Mr. Men? Mr. Yardy, he didn't get up in the morning like other people. Mr. Albanian gangster hangs out with Mr. Drug Dealer and Mr. Asylum Seeker. You know, the BNP love this. This does the work. We wonder why the BNP have gained seats in Burnley, Bradford, and down here in the south. The Sun, the Express, and the Mail are doing their job for them. Yes, they may have abandoned their jack boots for pinstripe suits, but they're taking these newspapers with the same racist bile to poison the minds of good people. The question is, what are we going to do about it? We don't have the luxury to put our heads in the sand. We don't have the luxury to hand it over for somebody else, because we know we have lily-livered politicians who, instead of facing down the bigotry, pander to it. So who's left? The people in this room. You wouldn't be in this room if you wasn't passionate about peace. You wouldn't be in this room if you wasn't passionate about justice. You know, as an activist, which I believe all of you are, we're not here for chit-chat. Chit-chats for the chattering classes. That's the truth. We're here to be active. We're here to talk to the communities, to engage, to inspire, to send a message that we're not asking to be listened to. We are democratically, we are positively demanding it. I'm here today because I want to show solidarity with you. My struggle is your struggle. Your struggle is my struggle. You cannot have a struggle that is not based on the human rights principle. Because if you do, as the oppressed, you quickly become the oppressor. That is the truth. So I stand before you as an activist, shoulder to shoulder with you in this struggle. I implore you to be passionate. I implore you not to have the luxury to give up. I implore you to make coalitions with other organizations that are fighting a similar struggle for justice, be it the women's struggle, be it the struggle for religious freedom, be it the struggle for young people, be it the struggle for elderly people, still in the struggle. I'm proud of you to come and listen to you here this afternoon, being a pensioner and not giving up. It fills me with great pride. We have a long way to go. And yes, we can miss the FA Cup semi-final because we believe in justice. We believe that if we don't do it, who will? Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Kira Box, I'm 18, and I wasn't planning on beginning by saying what Hands Up Peace was, because I've got a bit smart recently and kind of assumed that everyone knows. But then our chair today didn't have a clue who we were, so I put that in. But then our other chair has now explained what I do, so I'm thinking of taking it back out. But just to kind of clarify, basically Hands Up for Peace was an organisation set up by 3 of us when we were 17. We thought about just putting a banner on a bridge over the Thames with a message against war. And we were thinking, what would be a young person's message against war? And we were thinking, how are young people told to vote? How do we make our voices heard? And the way we thought that we are generally told to make our voices heard in school is put your hand up. Put your hand up if you want to do this. Put your hand up if you believe in this. Put your hand up to vote. So we thought, what are we putting our hands up for? How are we going to get ourselves noticed? We're going to put our hands up for peace. And so that was going to be the message on our banner. And then we began thinking, well, our argument in this is that Blair's going to war and he's the only one that wants to, and it's undemocratic. How can our protest be democratic? How can we ensure that it's not just us putting up a banner saying our hands are up for peace? And not representing all the other young people in the country. We don't know what their hands are up for. We don't know what they're thinking. So we decided to find out. We circulated an email. We started a website. We spread things through word of mouth. We went on the protests and the demos at the beginning. And basically, we just told people that if they had a message of peace, they should draw around their hand, they should cut it out on a piece of paper, they should decorate it, and most importantly, they should write their message for peace on their hand, their argument against war. Now, these range from, I don't like war, to peace is best, to a hand filled with an essay about the causes of war, why the war was for oil, and why they felt the war was economically, socially, and morally inviable. And so basically we had a whole range of things. We did put them up in Parliament Square. We aimed for 2,000. In the month before war broke out, we began collecting them. We actually collected 3,000. More kept coming in, even after the war had finished. And the response is so good. We're actually now a different organisation. We're called Hands Up For ... So young people now contact us whenever there's an issue they're upset about. At the moment, we're looking at nuclear war and the new arms race, and asking young people to put their hands up for their views on nuclear weapons. So basically, what I'm here today to say is I was looking on the UN website before I came here, and the opening line of the introduction to the UN Decade for a Culture of Peace, quote, state, "Today, more than ever, the concept of a culture of peace provides the way to confront emerging threats and challenges." That's what the UN says. But clearly our leader, and many other leaders around the world who I could name, but I'm sure everyone can think of them themselves, they don't think of that as a statement which should cloud their judgment. To them, the way forward is clear, and it is war. But to me, and most of my generation, the way forward is clear, and it is peace. And clearly this is something that needs to be addressed, because this message isn't getting through to the people who are making the decisions. When we took action in Iraq, when Israel and also Palestine again used violence to try and get their point across or to solve their problems, when our government lays down plans to develop a new generation of nuclear weapons, again and again, my generation repeat to ourselves, a culture of peace provides the way to confront these emerging threats and challenges. One of the most moving places I visited as a teenager was a small graveyard in France on a history school trip for GCSE. We were looking at the Somme, but on our way to the Somme, we stopped at a small graveyard, no more than a couple of hundred graves. There were no huge rows of white headstones. There were no walls of names written around the side of the cemetery. There were just rows of small crosses. And my memory of that graveyard just begins with one cross. And written on the cross on a small brass plaque was the word inconnu, which I guessed and found out later meant unknown. And on the next cross, there was another plaque, and again, it said unknown. And again, and I walked through the graveyard for an hour because I didn't believe there could be a graveyard in which every single grave was unknown, 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 and there was not a single name in there. We did not know who these people were who'd laid their lives down for us. They were just unknown. And I don't believe that our government can not just continue to do this, but can continue to make more, even more exciting ways of making huger and huger sections of the population, not only killing them, but making them unknown in death. And as a young person who will be growing up in this century, I find it disturbing this is how I have to live. After World War I, and again after World War II, as has been said already today, we continued to say there should not be any more war. We can solve things through a culture of peace. And then the Cold War started. And so we carried on solving our problems through war or the threat of war, through violence or the threat of violence. I am one of the generation who will grow into adulthood with a new generation of nuclear weapons. Despite our government's commitment under the Non-Proliferation Treaty to, and I quote, accomplish the total elimination of our nuclear arsenal, we're now aiming to build up new supplies. Bunker busters, mini-nukes, non-strategic battlefield weapons. I'm ashamed that the lessons I learnt so easily that day in my GCSE history class are so hard for our Prime Minister and for other leaders around the world to learn. I'm ashamed that what the UN has stated so clearly, this aim for a culture of peace, is so misunderstood by our leaders today. In 1958, my mother walked on the Aldermaston March. We look back at the Cold War as if it's a time that we've now left far behind and the threat of nuclear war has now dissipated. And if this is so, why this year in 2004 am I planning to walk in her footsteps? 2004 is the UN priority year for respect for all human rights. As part of the Decade of a Culture of Peace, this is this year's priority. But it seems that our leaders do not consider life or peaceful coexistence human rights which need to be protected. Next year, 2005, the Non-Proliferation Treaty is up for review, and I have little faith that we'll retain the current guidelines on non-proliferation, let alone move towards a more peaceful society. My generation are growing up with an inexorable movement towards more and more weapons, not of mass destruction, not WMD, but weapons of mass murder, of mass slaughter. And I think when it's put like that, it just doesn't sound as pretty. We sit there debating these acronyms, but what we're actually talking about is slaughter, hundreds of thousands of people who will forever be known as unknown. And it scares me to think of the world I might be bringing my children into. This isn't just the world I'm living in. It's not the world I'll be living in tomorrow. It's the world that I'll have to bring another generation into, and my generation will have to bring their generation of children into. And I hope that it will be a world in which we do finally adopt a culture of peace. We do finally respond to global challenges with peaceful solutions, and not one in which my children must once again march to Aldermaston and remember their dead only as unknown. We must challenge the idea that it is, as in the poem, brave and honourable to die for your country, and help our next generation to realise what our leaders haven't, that it is braver and far more honourable to live in and develop our world for today and for tomorrow and for our children. Thank you.
Very, very good.
Our next speaker is Lord Ahmed of the Interreligious and International Federation for World Peace. He'll speak to us for a few minutes about peace and understanding across both ethnic and religious boundaries, and I'd like to welcome him very much. Thank you.
Chairman, very distinguished ladies and gentlemen, Kira has made my speech a little difficult, so thank you. I want to say thank you to Ministry for Peace for inviting me here this afternoon. I want to assure John McDonnell and John Randall that anything they do in the House of Commons, I promise them that I will give them every support I can in the House of Lords for the establishment of Ministry for Peace. Of course, it makes sense. When we have Ministry of Defense, we know how to go to war, we know how to make war around the world, but we don't know how to make peace because we don't have Ministry of Peace. And we need to have people who can work for peace and also help in creating peace around the world, which is desperately needed. President Bush was visiting a school last week, I understand, and he was talking about the war on Iraq. And after his speech, he said to the children, he said, do you have any questions? And a young boy, Billy, put his hand up and he said, Mr. President, I have 3 questions. Where are weapons of mass destruction? How did you become president when Al Gore had more votes than you did? And where is Osama bin Laden? And then the school bell rang for the break, and half an hour later, children came back again. And he said, right, children, where were we? Any more questions? And a young girl puts her hand up and says, "Sir, Mr. President, I have 5 questions. Where are weapons of mass destruction? How did you become president when Al Gore had more votes than you did? Where is Osama bin Laden? Why did our school bell ring half an hour early today? And where is Billy?" They say Mr. Rumsfeld died, and well, I hope he does soon. He died and he went up to the pearly gates, and there at the check-in desk is St. Peter. And Rumsfeld approaches him and he sees this huge wall of clocks at the back. And he says to him, he says, "Hey, St. Peter, what are these clocks?" St. Peter says, "These are lie detectors. So when on earth you tell a lie, the clocks move." Or he says, "Whose is this clock? Because it seems like it's never moved." Or he says, "This is Mother Teresa's. She never told any lies, so it's never moved." And he says, "Whose is this one? This has moved quite a bit." And he says, "This is Abraham Lincoln's. He told a few lies, so it's moved." So he said, "Hey, St. Peter, where is my friend George W.'s clock?" St. Peter says, "It's next door. Jesus is using it for his ceiling fan." Thank you. My topic this afternoon is quite serious, and I just want to say that I do believe in interfaith work, because I think that interfaith brings down barriers and it creates better understanding between religions and cultures. Most of our problems in the world today, although religion is blamed, there is no religion that calls for violence. It is done in the name of religion, whichever religion it is. The most commonly heard religion on television these days is Islam. The basic Islam means peace. When somebody says to you, "Assalamu alaikum, may peace be upon you," all religions, whether it's Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Sikhism, Buddhism, all the religions, no religion teaches violence. But unfortunately, for many different reasons, we do. And until we have a dialogue, until we start talking to each other, and until we start understanding each other. When I go to the mosque, when I see the temples, I see the schools, and I see long, tall walls and also wire meshing on the windows, and sometimes even roller shutters. There are many people who would fear, and they wouldn't know what is behind them. And it's this curiosity. And only thing that you see is some young men burning the Union Jack outside a mosque, and I'll come to that. And what happens is it creates fear, it creates misunderstanding. And what they don't know is the reason why there are walls and also these wire meshing is so the BNP doesn't smash their windows or throws a firebomb into the mosque or a synagogue or a temple or one of the Islamic, so-called Islamic fundamentalists. There are a couple of groups here in London that I've been calling for deportation to their original countries, wherever they come from, because we don't want people who create hate between communities and misunderstanding. So when I met the first Jewish friends, when I met the first Hindu friends, I had this fear because I'd never come across any Jewish or Hindu people before. All I knew was what was happening in Palestine and what was happening in Kashmir. And then I find out that there are Jewish people who support the Palestinian people and their right to live in peace and harmony and live side by side with them. I know that there are Hindu people who want to see the Kashmiri people have right of self-determination. Similarly, there are people like me who are calling for abolition of blasphemy laws in Pakistan and elsewhere in the Muslim world, which are abused against and used against the Christian communities and the minority communities. So I'm so encouraged to hear peace mentioned so many times. But I think what we need to say also, peace with justice. Because unless we have justice, we will not have peace. And okay, my time is nearly up. I didn't realize. Just to make a point that outside Regent's Park Mosque, what you saw in the Times, massive big photograph, and I'm sure my colleague from the media is going to explain why they do this. 6,000 people go to the mosque on Friday prayer in Regent's Park Mosque. 6 people seeking publicity on the strength of these 6,000 people stood outside and burnt a Union Jack. I condemn them. But the very fact that they stand outside there and burn the Union flag, the rest of the community and the rest of our nation will see Muslims burning Union Jack. And that gives misunderstanding. And it's these perceptions that are then developed, and then the hatred is created out of that. And the only way we can do it is by meeting together, all religious groups, whether we do it at local level, whether we do it at regional level, national, and I even think that at United Nations level, we need to have an interreligious, interfaith council of some sort where all religious communities are represented. And I know the chairman wants me to sit down. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Our third speaker this afternoon is Annabelle McGoldrick, and she is the Director of Reporting the World, and she's asking a question, is peace journalism possible? So she will speak to us for 5 minutes.
Well, it's lovely to hear such a responsive audience this afternoon, so maybe I should be applauding you at the moment. Anyway, a little bit about myself. I've worked as a journalist, and I now, as well as being a Director of Reporting the World, teach MA courses in media and conflict at universities of Sydney and Cardiff in the UK, and also online for the Transcend Peace University and the UN Peace University. I'm also writing 2 books about peace journalism and editing a documentary on the conflict in the Middle East to explore aspects of peace journalism that are not usually covered by the mainstream media. So clearly, I think peace journalism is very possible. But first of all, what do I mean by peace journalism? A lot of people have the misperception, a lot of journalists in this country have the misperception that peace journalism means ignoring the violence and just talking about people being nice to each other. That's not what it's about to me. I work with a robust analytical model developed by many people around the world, especially in the last few years, from an original concept first thought of by Professor Johan Galtung, one of the founders of peace studies as an academic subject. Now, there's 4 main areas of peace journalism. The first one is avoid polarizing and demonizing the parties to a conflict. So very much the opposite of what Lord Ahmed was talking about in just showing those pictures of 6 people burning the flag. It's about seeking the other in the self and the self in the other. Number 2, it's about challenging propaganda to expose the lies on all sides, not just the other side, which also means drawing attention to hidden agendas for conflict. Number 3, peace journalism is about hearing from people, both as those suffering the effects of violence and as peacemakers. I'm afraid, the Ministry of Peace aside, I think peace is too important to leave to the politicians, and it's actually up to the people. And number 4, peace journalism is about exploring non-violent responses to conflict. This is an area that I feel is most misunderstood and absent from the mainstream media. So just a few further words on what those mean in practice. Firstly, if you think about polarization, that was taken to its extreme by the Rwandan hate radio station Radio Milkaline. And 10 years on from that horrific genocide, we must learn lessons to prevent it happening again. That radio station gradually built upon the perceived differences between Hutus and Tutsis, labeling them, the Tutsis, as the enemy, dehumanizing them as cockroaches and killers who must be exterminated to protect us. Now, it sounds a long way from what we experience, but I think there's actually some similarities in the kind of headlines we've seen in some newspapers in this country about asylum seekers, for example, about how this country is going to be invaded by the menace of asylum seekers coming to beg and steal and deprive us of our hard-earned taxes, and they'll live on benefits in luxury. I mean, you know, you can see the beginnings of it. The other point in this is that, to me, it actually escalates a conflict. In this way, war journalists end up being a little bit like sports reporters. And if you think about it, what keeps us from watching a football game? It is that compelling idea that one side's going to win and one side's going to lose. So defeat becomes unthinkable, and each side steps up their efforts to win. So the ultimate in this basic pattern of the tug of war is a meter gained by one side requires the other to lose a meter in the classic zero-sum game. So thinking of a conflict of a tug of war contains a built-in incentive to escalation, trying harder to avoid defeat. So, to me, there are some big questions for journalists to ask, whether they want to be responsible for escalating conflicts by depicting it as this tug of war, and also by amplifying war propaganda. Because, I mean, globally at the moment, that's all about the axis of evil and the war on terror. A recent comprehensive American study about media coverage of weapons of mass destruction concluded that because the American and much of the British media failed to challenge the political definition of weapons of mass destruction, the Bush administration could link Iraq with terrorism and so take us to war on false pretenses. Now, I have an extensive file on the number of propaganda lines brought by the media during the Iraq War, stories that I'm sure are familiar to many of you here today, like the miraculous, daring tale of rescue of Private Jessica Lynch, and all those days where they were saying they'd found weapons of mass destruction. All turned out to be untrue, didn't it, later down the track? On a note of optimism, I do think we've seen some improvements in the media in this country in interrogating those lines of propaganda. So definitely some improvement there. Thirdly, that point that peace journalism shows how people are suffering in war and how people are working to change things. Again, I think there have been some improvements. In the first Gulf War, all we saw were those appalling Star Wars images of fantastic precision weapons and no impact on the people who were actually dying as a result. Whereas I think in this war, we were brought some very disturbing and compelling images of the suffering of Iraqi people during this current Gulf War. There are two big holes in the coverage that, to me, peace journalism would have filled. Firstly, we're constantly told that war is about weapons of mass destruction, but we've since learned that that was just picked on for bureaucratic reasons, and that many people could see there was something, and Kira mentioned it, underneath, that it was all about war. Sorry, it was all about oil. But that was never, ever interrogated in the media. We never really understood how it was all about oil. It was more that it was a sort of saloon bar slogan. Now, what we needed and what peace journalism would have done would have explored that issue so that we could see in what sense it was about oil, what was at stake, and how our choices could affect the course of events. One thing some journalists picked up upon, and more should have done, was a campaign by the Detroit Project for cars that will take America to work in the morning without sending it to war in the afternoon. And they've produced some fantastic TV adverts with compelling messages like that, linking oil with the war in Iraq. The other massive gap in the coverage was about so-called regime change and how best to bring it about. Now, if we look about in modern history, there's some fantastic examples of regime change without violence. India, South Africa, Eastern Europe. How were dictators toppled? How were repressive governments swept away and democracy planted in its place? Not in any of these places by invasion, but by international pressure, including grassroots solidarity and non-violent direct action. So to me, an important task of peace journalism is to explore parallel situations where change has been brought about successfully without violence. And just briefly on the Middle East conflict, what we're constantly told about that, what we're constantly shown is blow-by-blow accounts of the violence. One day it's the Israelis who are the villains, the next day it's the Palestinians who are the villains. What we seldom see, and what peace journalism would show, is how the conflict affects the mass of ordinary people in everyday life. How Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory is a production line of violence. And peace journalism would bring out the perception, in the words of the Israeli peace movement, that the occupation is killing all of us. There are many groups on both sides in that conflict putting forward initiatives, carrying out bridge building, and opposing violence in all of its forms. We should hear much more from them than we do, and the peace journalism we're making puts them at the centre stage. I think I'm getting the eye here that I should wrap up fairly soon. But I just want to make 7 brief points, because it's all well and good saying this is a big idea. The issue is, how do you actually get there? And I have sort of seven headlines on 7 ideas on how to make peace journalism more possible. And the first one involves you, because it's about civil society becoming more visible. Now, just think back last year to the demonstrations in 600 cities on February the 15th. That ended up on every front page in every newspaper across the world, apparently except Japan, but anyway. So become unignorable. The next one is media activism. Don't just campaign through the media, campaign on the media. So be active, write to it, complain to it, criticize it, but also complement it, offer it alternatives. Put yourself forward as a commentator. You've heard Sir Elworthy and Paul Ingham today. They're very active in getting their voice heard on the media. The other one is praise and prizes. Australia has a 20-year history of a peace journalism prize that's now very sought after, very high profile, and so journalists are actively trying to create peace-enhancing media to try and win that prize. Self-criticism, well, that's what we tried to do with Reporting the World. That's because journalists are actually quite a sensitive lot, and they don't think anybody else understands them. So if you give them a quiet space on their own, it's amazing how much they come out and criticize themselves, because a lot of them are very irritated and annoyed and frustrated by the conventions of news and the drive for sensationalist ratings. So give them space to criticize themselves. There's 2 kinds of training I advocate. Training for the next generation of journalists, and perhaps I could persuade Kira not to be a politician and to be a journalist. So train the next generation, but also train those working in the profession now. It's quite difficult to do it in this country, but when you go overseas to conflict zones, as I do, journalists in places like Indonesia, Nepal, the Middle East, the Caucasus are desperate for tools in which they could apply to their job today to report more constructively on conflict. And they can see how the way they report can actually exacerbate the situation. So what they want to know is what could be practical and still pass as journalism to contribute to peace-enhancing processes. And the final one is alternative media. Lots of people doing fantastic work on the internet and indie media and those sorts of things. But just beware, a survey on the Iraq war showed that only 0.2% of people choose the internet as their top source of information. So we're still very much reliant as a society on the mainstream. So we have to find ways to bring pressure to bear on them. So I hope I've given you some insight into A, what peace journalism is, and B, how possible it is and what your role is to bring that about. Thank you.
Don't think you have to know everything. The website will tell you. And also, in terms of the website, think of it as your daily news. We want you to be able to go there and send us information that you know about, because you can do that. There's the means to do that. But you can also talk to one another using the different forums. But also, if you want to find out what's happening in the area of our kind of peace, which is kind of conflict prevention, transformation, that sort of peace, then look on the daily, look on the MFP website every day and see if there's something that appeals to you. There's also fantastic books from Amazon that you can get through the website, and they're all listed there. And lastly, we want you, and this is where we now begin to get into contact with the wider political world out there, is we want you to contact, this is the first time we're asking it, no, this is the second time actually, because we originally asked you to do that, to contact your MP for the bill that John proposed and was supported last October the 14th last year. Now we want you to contact your MP and there's a letter coming up. There we go. We want you, this will be on the website, and what we want you to do is we want you to, no need to mention the Ministry for Peace at this stage. In fact, it probably would be counterproductive. You, as a private citizen, write along, and the wording is there. In 1999, the UK government, along with all the other members of the United Nations General Assembly, agreed the Declaration and Programme and Action on a Culture of Peace. This aims to create values, attitudes and behaviours that address the root causes of violence with a view to solving problems through dialogue and negotiation among individuals, groups and nations. Can you please let me know what progress has been made on the initiative in the United Kingdom? Yours sincerely. Then we want you to tell us what they said, because we want to put a map on our website with all the constituencies, a little red light if it was, terrible response, and maybe amber if it was more positive, and green if it was like a really positive response. And then in the areas where we had the kind of the negative responses, we'll get you to charge off and do something else. So that's your first thing to do. The next thing, just very quickly to say, is that when you go away from today, apart from all the things that you are now going to do, join a group, talk to your friends, go to the website, and write your letter to your MP, you can come along. The next event we have is on the 26th of May, and it's around this area we all need to become better informed about this United Nations Declaration and Programme of an Action of Peace. And it has to be said that although we have all our other meetings have been in the House of Commons, attendance from the members of the Houses of Parliament is pretty pathetic, it has to be said. But we keep trying. There we are in their very own building. It doesn't take much to walk down the corridor. And we know that sort of a handful come from time to time, but it's not good enough. So, at the next meeting, we're going to invite Malcolm Harper, who's the director of the United Nations Association. And we haven't yet had confirmation, I don't think, from Hilary Bain. When the government was aware that they put their hand up in the General Assembly to support this declaration of peace, they decided to shunt it off to the Department for International Development, which of course is only a very small part of what the culture of peace is about. But anyway, it was shunted off there under Claire Short, and she then shunted it off to the British Council, who basically did nothing. So 4 years was wasted. Now Hilary Bain is trying to revive this initiative within his department. So we want to invite him along and say, hello, what are you doing? What's happening on this? So that's the 26th of May. On the 9th of June, we're getting very practical about you, me, and how we talk to one another. And most of you heard of Marshall Rosenberg, who's developed something called non-violent communication, a means of me being able to express what I need to you and you being able to express what you need to me. And we've got a real strategy for understanding and listening to one another. He's coming along on the 9th of June, and then before we break up, absolutely exhausted for the summer holidays, We've got the star of the show, the inspirer of this show, Congressman Dennis Kucinich, who's going to be coming over either very late June or very early July. And he's going to be talking about the work that he's doing standing for president. Now, he knows that he's not going to be, unless something very strange happens to Kerry's campaign, because I think only Kucinich and Kerry are left in the race now. So if Kerry fell off the twig, then Kucinich might get it, but I think it's a bit unlikely. But he is staying in the race right up to the end at great kind of personal cost to make sure that when there's a Democratic president, hopefully there will be a Democratic president, that president will have progressive policies. It's not just a question of Tweedledum and Tweedledee. He will actually have progressive policies. So that will be a fantastic meeting. So the 26th of May, the 9th of June, and look out on the website and if you're not already on the email to us, then you would have given it that information as you came in. And we look forward to seeing you at all of those. And now I'll hand over to John, who will talk you through how do we now take this forward again through the parliamentary process. Thank you.
That when we leave here, we all share the narrative about the approach. And so I want to talk about strategy as much as anything. I want to take up the point that Annabelle made and Kira, which was about, as we all know, peace isn't just about leaving it to the politicians. Within the overall peace movement and the peace strategy that we're developing, obviously we start off with how we develop as individuals. We then try and relate that to those values and principles to our own families and how we bring up our own children. And then we relate it to our communities. And then at some stage, we have to recognize, we have to engage in national and international political structures. We can do all that we can as individuals, and we can do all that we can as communities and families and others. But at some stage, someone will make a decision on our behalf at the political level, nationally or internationally, that we will want to exert an influence over. And although our demonstrations, as everyone has said, Lord Ahmed and others, were fundamental last year in terms of transforming people's attitudes and mobilizing whole new generations of people in the terms of the peace struggle, we have to recognize that, yes, we were, at the end of the day, ignored. I think we were effective in the end. I think we've most probably put paid to future wars in the coming decade, because I think Blair may well have learnt some lessons from it. Maybe not Bush, but maybe Blair. We may well have taught governments a lesson that we can mobilize and that we will, if necessary, mobilize in such numbers that it would just destroy confidence in their government for future years. So I think it was effective, but it wasn't effective in preventing that particular war. So we have to come to terms with the political process. Now, how do we do that? Well, there are different views about how the political process works in this country. But there's one view that we get taught in our schools, which is completely unreal. They think that MPs get elected to Parliament on a manifesto which everyone has supported and discussed, and they get into Parliament and they think great thoughts and they come independently to arrive at the best judgment they possibly can on a principled basis. Well, you know as well as I do that that's completely fictional. When Parliament or governments come to a decision, it is as a result of crude pressures that are applied to them. And largely it's the pressures that are applied to them around a politician's or a government's own sense of survival at the next election. And what we have in the discussions around peace or war is we have a policy network surrounding the Prime Minister and government which is dominated, and we've seen it today in the analysis, which is dominated by those who have a self-interest in war rather than in peace. So what we've got to try and do is recognize that when governments and ministers and prime ministers come to a decision, they take into account all the advice they're given, but they take into account the pressures that are applied to them, and they take into account whether or not they'll be re-elected at the next election. And what we have to do is break through that environment of advice and pressure to demonstrate that peace is an issue that they have to take into account, not just for self-survival, but because it is the right thing to do from their own perspective. So it's trying to break into that policy discussion that we're trying to do. At the moment, to be frank, and we should be honest about this, and someone said, don't be naive earlier. We mustn't be naive. As a peace movement, in relation to number 10, we're most probably shouting through the letterbox and looking through the keyhole at the moment, at best. At best. What we've got to do is become so strong in our argument, in our mobilization of popular support again, both in terms of our communities but also in Parliament itself and within the political process, that we're not looking through the keyhole or shouting through the letterbox. As Diana said, we'll be sitting at the cabinet table. Now, how do we do that? There are 5 strategic strands of work that we're already undertaking in our different organisations. And the point that Kira made about why are all these organisations competing amongst themselves is quite right. But I think we did learn, as Lord Ahmed said, we did learn a lot of lessons last year about how we come together in a united way and how effective we can be in mobilising people. And we've learnt that lesson. And from all that we've been doing in terms of the discussions of Ministry of Peace, it's been done on the principles of solidarity, of encouragement, of understanding one another's position and moving forward on a consensual basis. And that's been hard work, to be frank, and at times, it's slowed us down, but it's been worth doing it that way because we've maintained a united front. But how do we go about it? Well, there are 5 strands of work, and they're all interconnected. They all work together, and we've got to bring them together to a crescendo in the coming years to have maximum effect. The first has been mentioned. It is about what we do as part of what we now describe as civil society. So that means every one of us who has a connection with any organisation or group of individuals, we take the concept of the Ministry of Peace back to them, engage them in that discussion, and almost like political canvassing, sign that organisation up in support of the concepts. Now, whether it's a religious group or a political group or a trade union or just a community group of some sort, the Women's Institute or whatever, it's taking the concept back and saying, have you heard of this concept? Because it could be important to us as individuals, as a community, in securing global peace. So it's that influencing of civil society. We all have a responsibility to go back from today on the actions that Diana has outlined and on the discussion that we've had today to educate others and say, look, here's a route through that we as an organisation, no matter how small, no matter how uninfluential we think we are, we should discuss it and sign up to. We need to mobilise civil society in that way. And then as we move on in the coming period, we'll be mobilising around specific activities. And the activities are coming out of our ears at the moment. It isn't just about moving resolutions at political conferences or whatever. But Debbie King was saying early on today in a conversation, we've got the commemoration day on May the 15th for conscientious objectors. Let's be creative, mobilise organisations within your community. We've got in Camden, in one of the parks, we've got the statue that the stone that we commemorate around. Mobilise activities around that. Just on having a picnic that afternoon, some form of activity, discussion groups or whatever, in which we then say, by the way, have you heard about the Ministry of Peace project and how we could sign up for it? And if we're not fully aware of it, how maybe we can get someone along to talk about it within our group, within our church, within our Gurdwara, within our mosque. Just having that discussion and mobilising civil society. The second issue, and I'm really grateful for the advice that Annabelle gave us today, it's mobilising the media. She gave us 7 really helpful, constructive tips today. What we want to do is mobilise a media presence at every level, the specialist press, the independent media, the local, the regional and the national press, where wherever we're consulted about anything, we just slip the idea in. Whatever we're talking about, relate it back to the concept of peace and this new proposal for a new structure for peace. The third stream of work that we're looking at is the detail. It is no use us not knowing our own facts about our own proposal and how they can confront each issue. The discussion we've had today about arms conversion, I think, has been fundamental. You know, every time that argument has come up, all these jobs will go, you know, people will lose their jobs as a result of closing down these factories. Well, Kira answered a number of that, so did others. All that discussion about practical solutions to arms conversion that actually we've been working on for 30 years and just need re-nourishing. In the detail, what we're looking at is different groups coming together to say, how could a Ministry of Peace work? Getting the lawyers together to look at the legalities, getting the economists together to look at the economics issues around arms conversion and all the rest. We heard Tony Juniper around the environmental issues. It's building up a body of expertise so that we have the argument for every challenge that will be put to us. The fourth stream of work is the parliamentary. In the parliamentary process at the moment, what happened basically is we put forward our own piece of legislation. It was a 10-minute rule bill in which you can talk for 10 minutes, and if anyone wants to oppose you, they can talk for 10 minutes as well. And nobody did. It was interesting that nobody did, and it was interesting that we got cross-party support. We engaged a large number of people in the debate as a result of that. What we want to do now is go back and engage in that parliamentary process again, which means coming back with another bill, and I'm really grateful for what Lord Ahmed said, is that he'll assist in the House of Lords. Ideally, what we want to do is do a bill through the House of Lords and a bill through the House of Commons simultaneously, so we get both chambers debating it. Not that they'll pass it. They will not. It will not be carried by the House of Commons or House of Lords immediately. What we're trying to do is simply get them to debate. Diana has said we hold meetings at the House of Commons. I don't think we've had more than 5 MPs turn up walking 50 yards to get to the debate. What this does, though, it puts the bill on the floor of the House of Commons, on the floor of the House of Lords, where they have to listen. And they have to see it reported in Hansard. They have to get copies of the bill itself. And so it is, in the nicest possible way, intruding into their political consciousness in a way it's never done before. So what we want to do is keep on pummeling through both the Houses of Parliament the concept of a Ministry of Peace. If necessary, coming back year after year after year. But we know that it will not be passed unless government backs it. So therefore, linked to the parliamentary process, and this is the job about lobbying, is building up a critical mass of support within the major political parties and others that then gets reflected in the attitudes of MPs, so that when we put it up on one occasion, whoever is leading the individual political parties thinks this is something not only we shouldn't oppose, but maybe we should start thinking about adopting. And it's interesting that they didn't oppose. And it's interesting, John Randall is my friend and colleague who's in my next door constituency, has been fantastic all the way through. But he's a whip. He's been reappointed as a whip for the Conservative Party. He would not be allowed to be on this platform if his chief whip didn't give him permission. So it's interesting that even the Conservative Party is saying, we're willing to listen to this view, we're willing to listen to this argument. That's happened with all the major political parties now, because none of them could have easily had one MP stand up and oppose the bill. None of them did. So we're in a quite interesting period that the major political parties are willing to listen to this idea. Nothing more than that at this stage. Just listen to it. And you know as well as I do, why that's the case. You know exactly why that's the case. Because for a year, a war has gone on in Iraq, and day after day, people are being murdered and killed. 500 American soldiers, 50,000 Iraqis, and what was on our TV screens last week was abhorrent. Bodies being burnt and towed through the streets, but it reflected people's anger. Now, even in the depth of number 10, and I think even in the depths of the White House, there's a recognition now that this isn't working. This is a disaster. How can we get out of this situation? But above all else, how can we avoid this ever happening again? So all of a sudden, there's a climactic opportunity for us to influence the people who are desperately looking for another solution. So the parliamentary process is important. The fifth strand of work, as someone mentioned it earlier, is the European and international work that we need to do, because it will reinforce It will reinforce what's happening in this country if we can have the discussion and debate going on elsewhere. It's important that we link up with Dennis when he comes across, because if Kerry does win, there's not going to be a major advance for this project as such, but it opens up an avenue of further debate and discussion in the Democratic Party in America. But also what we need to do is make sure we mobilize every link that we have across Europe and across the world, so that church to church, mosque to mosque, Gurdwara to Gurdwara, civil organization to civil organization, women's groups, campaigning groups of all sorts across the world are raising the issue, and that we politically link up through other parliaments, to the European Parliament, and every other structure we can think of to reinforce the message. What I want to see is that when Blair travels around the world, and he turns up in Germany, France, Spain, or Japan, or whatever, and he walks down that plane, what would be fundamentally important to him is not just when he looks down, he sees people with banners saying Ministry for Peace across the world, that he can't avoid the issue, but in addition to that, he turns up, and wherever he is, whether it's Congress or elsewhere, he's made aware that that Parliament or that Assembly or that Congress is debating that issue also. We've got to build up such a climate and environment of opinion that this issue can't be avoided. And the way to do that, I think, is just to mobilize the resources that we already have and bring on new forces as well. They're the 5 streams of work that we do. I'll go back to the civil society issue and just address this issue that Keir raised as well. We need to ensure that we link up with the next generation. In fact, what we need to do is appoint Keir as our youth advisor as fast as possible before she leaves the room, really. But we need to ensure that we are going out in the most open consultation and discussion, saying this isn't the complete answer. This is one element of securing peace by using the political structures that are there at the moment. But there'll be other structures, there'll be other mechanisms. This is just one to complement, in a completely non-competitive, in a completely cooperative way, all the other mechanisms that we're using. But this could be, I think, one of the most effective things that we do in the coming period, and that's why many of us want to devote our time to it in the coming months and weeks. That's the narrative I think we should take out. Part of the overall peace struggle, one element of it, 5 strands of work. We're going to engage in each of those strands cooperatively in a way in which we think will be successful, and we're going to do it, and I use this word, people sometimes don't like it, we will do it in a professional way. We will do it in which we really understand what we're doing, where we have all the answers, in which we have as well the ability to learn professionally as we go along. Last week, I'll shut up on this, I've had enough. I don't want to go through another week like last week. And it all came together. It was a microcosm of tragedy. A few years ago, I did a meeting around the corner in Red Lion Square, and it was about the Hamill family, about the young Irishman who was kicked to death, and the soldiers and the police stood to one side and allowed it to happen. And on the platform was a friend of mine called Rosemary Nelson. Last week, they declared the inquiries into the Hamill family and what happened to their son. When Rosemary Nelson left that meeting, she went back, and 2 days later she turned on the ignition of her car and was blown up and died as well. And then during the week, last week as well, we saw the terrible events in Iraq. But what they don't report either is how many Iraqis were also blown up and killed last week as well. Last week was a microcosm of everything that's wrong, and everything that's wrong because we haven't secured peace. And what we've got to do is make sure none of us go through another week like that again. And we can do that if we take peace right to the heart of government and right to the heart of power. Thanks a lot.